Ooh,
Um, hey, Rich, thanks for taking the call.
of course,
Want to
Devindra.
chat with you about how AI can be applied to education, but would love it if you can do a quick introduction for yourself so people know about your wonderful career.
I'm sort of embarrassed. Let's see. Uh, I came to Seattle almost more than 30 years ago now, and I worked at Microsoft for a long time with our mutual friend Pradeep,
Yeah,
who's amazing, and then spent a bunch of time, spent 15 years as a venture capitalist, mainly in China and also here in Seattle, and then the last almost 5 or 6 years have been doing the entrepreneurship thing. So working on, I guess now AI is a big category, but back then it was sort of controversial. But I worked on a computer vision startup, which we ended up selling to a tier one auto supplier. In the last 2 or 3 years, have been thinking about all things artificial intelligence and machine learning. And I think guess that's how we got acquainted, at least on this go around.
that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
awesome. So AI is the big buzzword, and your and my common interest right now is how AI can be applied to education. So,
Oh, yeah.
wanted to get your take on before we get into how it can be applied to education. I wanted to understand what do you perceive as AI? What do you think is artificial intelligence?
Well, no one can actually define it, right? No one knows what it is, but I think today it means the application of what's so-called deep learning.
Okay.
So this new idea of a neural network where you train something on a bunch of images or text, and amazingly, the computer learns, so it programs itself. Just every time I say it, it sounds completely amazing, don't you think, Devindra? I
Yes,
mean, it's
it
just
does.
like, how does it do that? How do we invent a computer that can teach itself?
Yeah, it teaches itself and it teaches humans how to program now with codecs from
Oh, yeah.
OpenAI. It's amazing. You can put in a natural language prompt and it just generates code for you. It's buggy code, but it's nevertheless excellent.
Well, it gets you really started. That's the thing. And we'll talk about this for education, but what an advantage because I've had so many people, the very first thing I ever did was I was a TA for an introduction to computer class. And I'll never forget this woman. She was in her second career. She was a dancer.
Mhm.
She, danced for some of the big dance companies. And she just, the day she got her first for loop to work, I just will never forget that bright look in her eyes and the feeling of success.
Yeah,
I've lost track with her, but I just feel like that is the miracle. Programming is so hard and complicated, and maybe we can make it easier and get more people to learn it because it certainly is a super valuable skill.
that's true. And when people get their first program to compile, it's an amazing sense of
Oh,
accomplishment. Yeah,
I still will never forget the smile on her face as she got the thing to run. And
that's
that joy never ends, right? I'm sure you've seen it many times. Just
yeah,
such an amazing feeling to help someone do that.
yeah. So
And I think we have
speaking
the opportunity to do it at scale now.
exactly, exactly. And that's in fact a great transition into education because how can AI not only get joy to kids who are learning to program, but how can AI actually help get kids joy in learning overall?
Oh, I think you're so right. I mean, just getting a machine to work, which is what programming is it, it's that motivation that you need. One of my very earliest experiences was we had someone to take care of our kids. We have kids, and she was a nanny, and she just could never get through school. And I think you'll appreciate this. I gave her a Palm Pilot. Remember those old little Palm devices? And she always said, "I'm not a student. I'm not a student. I don't understand this." But just the fact she had some mastery over this device helped. And I'm proud to say, as a result, she got her high school equivalent degree. She got her bachelor's degree, and she actually has a master's in education now.
Wow.
So just that one little thing that I can learn this changed her entire life, literally changed her whole life. And so I think that's what we need to bring to literally a billion people. I mean, there's so many people who don't have that opportunity.
Yeah, exactly. And so speaking of which, you say bring it to a billion people. I've heard of many cases and stories where AI can help with as a personal become personal tutor, help kids and teachers with their test prep, with test correction, act as a global encyclopedia. Those are wonderful and obvious scenarios. But the challenging question here is, how do you design these AI solutions for a global audience, low cost and scalable?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that as you know, Devindra, this has been a huge problem. I was in China. We founded we worked on a number of educational startups there when China was much, much poorer than it is today, and just scaling it super hard. I think the good news is these so-called large language models like ChatGPT are showing that while the big ones still need to be run in the cloud, if you have a very specific use case, you can get them to run on a laptop
Okay.
and potentially even a phone. And that kind of development, we can talk about quantization and teacher-student models. That I think is the most promising thing I've heard in a long, long time for education.
I see. So what you're saying is that if I have a language model, which is not so large, maybe like a mid-sized language model, which can run locally on the edge on my phone, then
Yep.
I don't need the high bandwidth connectivity that we take for granted in the US or.
Yeah, I think that's the big promise. I often cite the statistic. You and I were around in 1995. I trust.
Yeah.
And I often reflect that a mid-priced phone that costs $200 or $300 here in the US and will cost like $50 in 3 years
Mhm.
is by itself more powerful than the most powerful computer in 1995, the Cray supercomputer.
Yeah.
So that computer that cost millions and millions of dollars is now in everyone's pocket. So we can't judge what can happen when computing costs drop by a factor of 1 million, which in fact they've had over the last 20 or 30 years.
Yeah. Agreed. Absolutely right. And, I read some statistics that the smartphone penetration in a country like India is pretty high, right?
Yes.
It's
Yep.
amazing. And statistically and anecdotally, I've observed that. I've seen really disadvantaged poor kids with an access to a cell phone or a smartphone rather. So do you think that's what we should be focusing on? How do we get an optimized language model onto these smartphones so that they can be getting personalized attention through these phones?
Well, there's always the brass ring, which is where I think we're headed. I think the first thing to do is just see what these models are capable of
Okay.
and see, even with the most powerful ones, can we really help people?
Yep.
And then I just think engineering is going to work this way. It has for the last 50 years, which is it'll be able to run on a laptop, and then it'll be able to run on a phone, and who knows where we go from there.
So are you envisaging this as an app that somebody downloads on the phone and the app actually has an embedded language model and the
Yeah,
training built
yeah.
into it?
Technology is such that if you and I dream of it, it's already being done around the world in 100 places.
Yeah, yeah.
But just the fact we talked about it means that someone's working on it right now. And so I just have a lot of confidence. I know that in the startups I'm working on, people are already saying, well, that's great in the cloud, but let's scale it down to a laptop. And you're only a short throw away from there to saying, let's run it in a small machine. There have even been experiments where it's running on non-GPU devices. It's a little technical, but even a Raspberry Pi, which costs about $25, can run various forms of computing, including smaller language models. And I just think that it's inevitable that we'll be able to get it to run on a small phone.
So do you think there's a commercial opportunity, or do you think these are social ventures that need to be tackled by people because of philanthropic attitude, or do you think there's money to be made here?
I think the commercial incentive just powers things quite tremendously. And I think in countries like India, the drive for education is a big driver. In China, for instance, which is not the same market, but education comes up over and over again as one of the top things. And if you can get people to spend even a little bit of money and create even a small commercial incentive, I think that just makes it easier. So I'd like to think that you can make a little money and also do good at the same time.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, when I was growing up in India, the local fruit seller had a basic income of maybe a few dollars a month, but she would save most of it to educate her
Yeah,
child.
yeah,
Right? And
yeah.
parents over there do not want their kids ending up with the same uh, future that they had. So you're right. They absolutely save money to educate their child, and that's a big expense. My parents did that for us. We had, I think, 50 or 60% of my parents' income went into educating my brother and I, and so
I-
grateful,
I'm
thankful.
I'm so grateful to your parents for doing that. It is such a huge sacrifice for a parent
Yeah,
to spend like that, and look what they ended up with, you and me.
that's sweet. No, exactly. I'm so grateful. I'm thinking of them and thanking them. It's like to spend 40 to 50% of your annual income on your child's education. That's just amazing. So,
Yeah.
Rich, what do you think would be the biggest challenges in rolling out these solutions at scale?
Oh, I think the biggest challenge is clearly um, having it reach everywhere in India will be very, very difficult and expensive. And it's going to take a small number of dedicated technology folks. And I like to think the little group that we're creating is one of those groups
Yeah.
because it takes inspiration to do these things and focus and desire. I still remember meeting the gentleman, just to tell a story, we ended up funding a pre-education school company. And its basic business model in China, this is obviously not India, was to bring education to everybody for at that point the lower middle class. And
Mhm.
he was an educator, but it took his determination and vision to get his company funded to millions and millions of dollars. So I think this is a classic case where Indian entrepreneurism can be successful. So I'm very optimistic about this.
Agreed. And there are some Indian unicorns with multi-billion dollars worth of value that cater
Exactly.
to the education system, right? So there's ample commercial opportunity as well over here. Um, do you think that these would have to be offered in multiple languages? Would these need to be
Well,
localized or
that's sort of the beauty of chat GPT and the large language models is they're already sort of localized already. I
yeah,
mean, I did one thing which I think is very important to explain, which is that this is not just another kind of computer education. For the first time, we can have a realistic dialogue and sort of a interlocution between the student and a smart teacher that doesn't require a real human. Now, the reason for that's important is because it's a scale issue. You
yeah,
know, as we know, we all both invested in Indian education, and there's just so many people,
yeah.
and so anything that gives you a multiplier is going to be a huge advantage. And I'm just so excited about this. I actually prepared some demos for this, which I think show what's possible with very little training, because the large language models have in fact built-in easy translation into Hindi or into French or into a variety of languages. And I think that's a huge advantage because localization is, has always been the big Achilles heel of all the software. Like, how do you make it seem natural?
Yeah, that's awesome. Did you want a demo? Do you want a screen?
Yeah, I can demo it to you right now. Let's see. You have to enable it. There's a little button for enabling. You see.
And
Let's see. Find the.
yeah, I can see the screen and
Can you see the screen?
yeah, and I
Oh,
resumed recording.
fantastic, fantastic. Good. Okay. Well, I just want to point out what you can actually do with this. Let me see if I can share it. Are we sharing? Am I sharing right now? I'm trying to share mode here. Can you see? Oh, here it is. Got it. I just turned it off because I'm an idiot. So, how incredible. Now, I have to apologize. I don't speak uh, any of the languages from India. So I just wanted to give you an example just in French, which I do sort of speak.
Mhm.
But here's an example. How do I say, uh, and I was just in France, so this is actually very relevant things. I walked into a restaurant and I had to say, oh, my party is actually inside the restaurant. How do you do it? And I want to attribute this to Paul Moritz, whom I think we both know, and his insight that the advantage of this system is this interactive dialogue. So you sort of meet the student where he is. So it says, how do you say in French, excuse me, I'm meeting my party in your restaurant? And it says, to say, excuse me, I'm meeting my party in your restaurant in French, you can say. And then the interesting thing is this is just the textual, but you can actually connect this to a text to speech system, which is basically say, excusez-moi, Je rencontre mon groupe dans votre restaurant. And now here's the interesting thing. This word rencontre, which I don't really know, well, what does it mean? And so you can just say, why do I use rencontre? And you notice that there was no extra training. We didn't have to teach it. We didn't have to program it. That's what costs money. It says the verb rencontre in French means to meet or to encounter. It gives a complete explanation. So the word meeting is used as a verb to indicate you're going to gather with your group. And this is why it's appropriate. And now it turns out I know a little French, and I know this word prendre, which also means to take or to find. And I said, well, why can't I just say je veux prendre? And it says, well, the phrase prendre means I want to take in French. And while it may make sense in some contexts, it may not be the best way to express the idea of your meeting a party in a restaurant. In French, when you want to say that you are meeting someone at a particular restaurant, it's more common to use the verb rencontre or retrouver to meet up with. And so you can see it's very naturally, and somewhere must be a French training system in it. It's very naturally explained to you what it means. And it actually does say, well, it may be understood if you say je veux prendre, it may sound awkward or unclear. And so you see, this is an example where the system is meeting the student where they are, right? And it can ask it questions. Now we could have written this up, right? Write a program to do this, but this is actually in the large language model. And I think that's the power.
This is
What do you think?
fantastic. So it retains the context from the previous question and answer.
Exactly.
And that's awesome. I took German for a couple of years in school, and I used to memorize the translations without understanding why
Yes.
and what I needed to do. With this kind of depth of conversation, this is just phenomenal. I can
Yes.
actually understand the nuance of the language.
And you can change languages. So let's just try this. How do I say this in Hindi? It says, how do I meet my party in a restaurant? Now you can in a restaurant. Now you can tell me whether this is correct or not. I've tried this for Chinese and it actually works. So you can tell me whether that's accurate or not. But as you can see, it helps you a lot. And it's interesting because it knows, since I'm speaking English, that it provides, if you will, the so-called, the sort of phoneticization, as opposed to just doing this. And I think this is the value, right? I just switched from French to Hindi. Think about this. Before this, how many man hours of programmer time would we need to do this?
Absolutely right. This is phenomenal. So it's right. मैं रेस्टोरेंट में मेरे साथी के साथ से कैसे मिलूं? How do I meet my party in a restaurant? Absolutely right. And it's explaining what each word means and the context.
Yes.
This is phenomenal. So this conversation and the ability to go into the depth of why is going to be phenomenal, helping the child really.
And I want to at this point give you say this is completely Paul Maritz's insight, and all I'm doing is a demo that shows it. Can I show one other example that shows it for programming?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So how many times have you just wanted to ask a teacher, here's my Python program, what's wrong with it? And it says if A is greater than B, then B equals 2. Now, 90% of all programming languages, this is pretty close to correct, as you and I both know, right? But it is actually incorrect in Python. And here's what it says. And this is because the large language model, in this case, ChatGPT, has ingested so much programming documentation. It knows there are a few issues with this program. You provide a semicolon at the end of the first line. It's not necessary in Python. The colon is missing after the if statement. There should be an indentation for the second line, and there's no closing of the program with a print. It even tells you you're not going to get any outputs, right? And it actually even gives you the corrected version. If A is greater than B, colon, B equals 2, print B, right? Now, here's the interesting thing. You can ask it real questions. And again, you're meeting the student where they want to be, which is, why don't you need a then in a Python if statement? And it actually gives a very good philosophic reason. In Python, the if statement is followed by a colon instead of the keyword then, like in some other programming languages. The colon indicates the start of a new block of code that should be executed if the condition in the if is true. The reason why Python does not use then is mainly due to its design philosophy. So actually it gets into this philosophy of design, which is super fascinating. Now, I just wanted to show this actually works. You can actually say, please explain this in French. And I read a little French, and this is actually correct. On Python instruction, if a suivre the point. And I actually tried, please explain this in Hindi. And I'll leave this to you as to whether or not it's correct or not. But again, there was no work done to actually make this translation. Now, this is not perfect. It requires some hints. You need to customize it and so forth, but it is very possible, I think, just take this, say, Python instruction and shrink it down and get it to run on a small computer or a laptop or whatever.
Yeah.
And I just want to leave this last thing.
Go
You
ahead.
can even say things like, how would I write the Python code in the style of hip hop? So if you are a hip hop fan, here you go. Yo, let's get coding with Python. So we can really meet the students where they are.
That's hilarious. That's absolutely hilarious. So, in fact,
Yeah.
explaining to the program in Hindi or in a style that's more appealing to the student, that's amazing. Some of my most talented colleagues in engineering are not fluent in English.
Yeah.
And so, in fact, that brings us to the last question before we run out of time, Rich.
Mhm.
How do we ensure inclusion? So, in this case, you were including students who are not fluent in English to take part in learning programming in a more effective way.
Yeah.
Overall, what do you think are the challenges for AI in being an inclusive teacher?
Oh, I think being inclusive is a huge challenge. I mean, it is really difficult. There's such a have and have nots thing. There's gender disparity, racial disparity, ethnic disparity. So I think it's one of the key things you have to think about first. To me, the big issue here is, first of all, these large language models do have biases in them, but there's ways to fix it. There's technologies such as reinforcement learning with human feedback that can fix these things. But I think the bigger thing is, in the things that you and I work on, let's make sure we don't leave people out.
Mhm.
That this, and I think that requires two things. One is having the sort of the out groups included in the discussions about developing this technology.
Mhm.
And the second thing is an explicit strategy that says, no, we need to reach out to everybody. And a lot of times, practice and strategy sort of one comes after the other. But in this case, yeah, let's make sure that every woman in India gets educated. Let's make sure that everyone who is poor in a village gets educated. It comes from that dedication, I think.
That's a fantastic vision. So thank you for participating in the think tank to think through low-cost,
Oh,
scalable education solutions. We could go on and on about this conversation. Like you and I are both super passionate about it.
absolutely.
But thank you for kicking off this conversation, and I hope we can do this a lot
We're gonna
more.
do this a lot more, man. This
Yeah,
is great, and we're gonna have an offsite and everything else. I'm super
yeah.
excited about it.
Thank you, Rich. You have a
Okay, hey, this worked. We even did it in the 40-minute time limit.
yep, we did.
It's good.
Thanks again.
Okay, man.